Am I running my zone 2 runs too fast or too slow? Should I be at the top of zone 2 or the bottom of zone 2? No one ever asks about the middle. But to answer these questions, we need to understand the science of zone 2 to truly understand how to maximize our potential when we're doing zone 2 and why it's so beneficial for developing an aerobic capacity and becoming a better runner. Right, so what we want to understand first is some basic metabolic principles that exist around exercise intensity and specifically zone 2. So if we have energy output on the y-axis and then we have exercise intensity on the x-axis, we're going to map fat and carbohydrate utilization. It's going to be pretty basic for now, but what I've got here is fat and then we have carbohydrate. So if I just call that carb, hopefully you can see that. Okay, so we've got carbs and fat, and then we have this metabolic crossover point. You may have heard about this before. It is where carbohydrate metabolism dominates as an energy source above fat. As we increase exercise intensity, fat pretty much diminishes to zero. It's not ever going to be completely zero, but if we thought about, Noah Lyles running a 100-meter sprint, he's not using it. Who cares about fat, right? So if we call that the maximum intensity, and then if we're just walking, we're mostly using fat. So somewhere in the middle there is going to be a point where they cross over. So yes, we can manipulate the crossover point if we are manipulating our carbohydrate intake, but for the premise of this, it's not really going to matter, as I'll get into later. But we have this metabolic crossover point, and kind of around there or just before there, maybe somewhere in here, is going to be fat max, which is our maximal fat oxidation state. And so in terms of a lactate threshold, because that's predominantly what I use in all of my terminology and my zones and threshold systems, we're going to be looking at, say, 75 to 80, I'm going to call it 88%. 88% of our lactate threshold. Somewhere in here is going to be fat max. Yes, like I said, you can have a metabolic crossover point that is far to the right, which will happen when, one, we manipulate carbohydrate intake, and if we are extremely metabolically flexible, which was the topic of my PhD. Likewise, if we're hugely carbohydrate dominant in our diet or extremely untrained, then we're going to be shifted to the left where that crossover point is going to happen earlier, and we're going to be more carbohydrate dominant. But for now, what we're looking to do with zone 2 runs is maximally oxidize fat. Why? Well, actually, first, before I get on to that, I'll map out lactate threshold or lactate accumulation in here as well, so you can kind of get an understanding of what that looks like. Because if we have a lactate concentration at rest, it's going to be 1 or near 0, between 1 and 0, and then it'll kind of tick along until we have our classic lactate curve. This lactate curve is, we're going to have our first point of inflection, and then we're having the rapid point of inflection where somewhere in here is what we'd call the heavy exercise domain. So here we have that LT1, which is going to be around your marathon intensity, what I call the crest point between zone 2 and zone 3, so around that 88 to 90%, somewhere around there in terms of a percentage of lactate threshold, and then your actual LT2, which is your traditional lactate threshold. So here you can see, now this is a slight point of confusion for people, is that we can be burning carbohydrate aerobically and anaerobically, so without oxygen. As we increase beyond our fat max or our zone 2, we start to increase our utilization of carbohydrate beyond fat, so there's a different stimulus there. Then we also start to increase our lactate production beyond which is sustainable. So we have a relative steady state through here between LT1 and LT2 in the heavy exercise domain. But with the O2 slow component and the buildup of fatigue, even running at LT1 for extended periods of time, will increase our reliance on carbohydrate and our production of lactate anaerobically. So what that means is, this is why the drifting into zone 3 or going to the very top of zone 2 all of the time starts to induce a different kind of stimulus. Now I'll get into how that works. But that's the general premise, right? So what we're trying to do with zone 2 is maximize this fat oxidation state. Now, by itself, it's just saying that we want more fat to utilize. We want to utilize more fat because it is abundant as an energy source. As we know, carbohydrate is relatively limited, and we need to supplement with carbohydrate during our exercise to get maximum performance potential out of ourselves. So then we have what's called ROS, reactive oxygen species. We have the AMPK, reactive oxygen species, and adenosine monophosphate kinase, AMPK. Now these are signaling molecules that induce a metabolic adaptation. Now what we want is, let's see, if I draw the muscle cell, within the muscle cell we have the most important, what would this called be, vessel, which is our mitochondria. Hopefully you can see this. I'll call this mito. So that's our mitochondria. These powerhouses are what turn oxygen, so O2 and fat, into ATP. That is our energy, right? Then that energy we can use to, if this is our muscle cell, contract our muscle, which we use to run. ATP then forms that's shocking, a MP, adenosine triphosphate, adenosine monophosphate, because we use those phosphates, two of them, to do all the metabolic energetic transfer that we need for muscular contractions. The relationship between the two, ATP to AMP, that relationship is the signal. So the concentration between the two, the ratio, signals AMPK. When we signal AMPK because we have a large monophosphate concentration, because we've contracted a lot, we've exercised for a large period of time, we then stimulate AMPK, which then stimulates PGC1 alpha. Peroxisome, don't ask me. I forgot what that means. But this is the main thing that is going to say we want more of these, more mitochondria. We need more energy production, or not energy transfer vacuoles within our muscle cell so that we can generate more ATP to try and normalize this equation. Right, then we have reactive oxygen species. This essentially is leaked oxygen from the mitochondria, which is typically superoxide, and that superoxide needs to be transferred into a way less oxidizable format, because otherwise it will just cause all kinds of havoc. And so what we have is like glutathione and some other processes, but pretty much some of our oxygen leaks out of the mitochondria in a very reactive state that also stimulates for adaptation. So that, because what's happening is our flux of oxygen through the mitochondria to generate the energy we need for muscular contractions is outweighing our actual capacity to metabolize or transfer that oxygen into a usable form, so it leaks out as reactive oxygen species. Again, that is going to stimulate PGC1 alpha, and this is it is actually relatively simplistic, because some biochemistry nerds out there will be like, there's more processes to that, because this is not necessarily a transcription factor by itself, but it activates the transcription factors. Transcription factors are the things that turn our DNA into actual enzymes and proteins. So then this is all stimulating mitochondria. Mitochondria, the more of these we have, more oxygen to ATP. More ATP we have, the more muscular contractions we can do, which means the faster we can run for the same effort, or we can just use less effort to run the same speed. So that's why we can, if we're controlling or monitoring our exercise intensity, our zone 2, heart rate zone 2, that's how we can improve our pace and power output at the same heart rate, because we're able to extract the same amount of oxygen, but we can utilize so much more of it. Then this comes down to now, why does zone 2 matter in this scenario? Well, why it matters is because as soon as we start to increase our zone 2, so we're going to drift into, we're right at the top, okay, and we're drifting into zone 3. We are introducing an increase in all of these stimulating factors. Along with that, at this stage, for the most part, like I said with that metabolic crossover point, can I draw that somewhere where it might be kind of visible? I'll do that here, right? So we've got this metabolic crossover point, we have fat going down there, and we have carbohydrate going up there. Carbs and fat, and then we're trying to hit something in there, zone 2. Okay, so there, remember I said it's going to be a little dependent on how much carbohydrate and fat you're burning depending on your diet, if you're doing fasted training, how well trained you are, all those things. But there is that point at which when we have our lactate curve in here somewhere, we do begin to increase anaerobic metabolism. So I just do O2, put a cross through it. So because anaerobic is without oxygen. What happens there is we increase carbohydrate utilization when we start to drift into zone 3, because we're going up that side of the exercise intensity graph, and that's energy. Right, we're increasing energy output, we're increasing intensity, so we need to be able to stimulate the flux of that energy. And what we do is we buffer it, well, the energy demand, by fast acting fuels, which is carbohydrate. The carbohydrate, anaerobically without oxygen, can be metabolized outside of the mitochondria. How am I going to draw this over here? I'll try green. Green doesn't quite show up as well. But, okay, so I've got green. So we'll just have our carbs. You might not be able to see it, but at least it kind of gives a reference. And that's going to form La minus, which is lactate, and a hydrogen ion. So lactic acid doesn't actually exist really in the body because of the acid-base balance. It'll immediately dissociate a hydrogen ion, which increases in acidity. Now this is by itself good for this whole AMPK, reactive oxygen species, and then also some other signals to increase the mitochondrial biogenesis, proliferation, so the increased number of mitochondria. But it is extremely taxing on the metabolic system, because then we need to get rid of these hydrogen ions and then we buffer them with bicarbonate. But just to touch on this, when we are running a marathon, we're kind of in this zone just above zone 2, right? And so hydrogen ions by itself, is not going to be the limiting factor in your performance. So you can take as much bicarbonate as you want. You're not increasing your capacity to run a marathon, because the hydrogen ions can just easily be buffered by your current bicarbonate pool, which will then dissociate from carbonic acid into water and CO2, which you breathe out. It's not until you get way up here that our anaerobic metabolism is at such a rate that hydrogen ions begin to accumulate, and we need a form of, we don't need, but a potential form of additional buffering capacity, so an increased bicarbonate pool in our blood, could be beneficial for exercise performance. But in training, yeah, sure, if you're doing like really hard 400, 200 meter repeats, but in ultra endurance and long distance endurance exercise, I can't see any evidence for bicarbonate increasing the capacity of someone to exercise. In triathlon, if there's, Ironman people doing it, the beginning of the swim is extremely anaerobic and very intense to make sure they get to the front bunch. So, there's differentiations there. So anyway, when we are pushing out, when we're exercising without oxygen, carbohydrates are forming lactate and the hydrogen ion, and we have to get rid of both the lactate through monocarboxylate transporters on the cell as well as the hydrogen ions. Now that by itself is a positive stimulus overall for the muscle, but chronically it starts to pull away a different kind of adaptation because we can do it without oxygen. We can do this equation here, we can do this metabolic process without the need for mitochondria. So the stimulus to need mitochondria is not as large as if we take a slight step back in intensity. So we come back into zone 2 and we are predominantly using fat as our fuel and oxygen, and then we are keeping an equation that is adaptable. The adaptable part is super important because we are training so regularly, and this is part of where this overall oversimplification of zone 2 can creep into part of that dogmatic understanding of zone 2 is good or bad. Because you may have seen high intensity interval training, so if we have HIIT training, what is it? High intensity interval training. Yeah, so HIIT training is better for getting mitochondrial biogenesis, enhancing aerobic capacity than zone 2. Now, by itself, again, this is true because we can get a more intensive stimulus. High intensity interval training would look like this, right? You do, say, we'll call this 30 seconds, and then you recover, and we're just going to do a traditional one would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. Okay, times 8, and it's 30 seconds on off. On off, and then you do that 3 to 4 times. And that is going to be a better stimulus than zone 2, which is obviously just, and you're kind of doing this at, I don't know, say like 105 to, oh, this is absolutely shocking. You're probably not even going to be able to read this, but some of you just listen, so that's all good. 105 to 120% of LT, lactate threshold pace or power. And then zone 2, obviously you're doing around 75 to, in my system, 88%. Why did I do a 4? LT. So you get a way more intensive stimulus from HIIT training, high intensity interval training, than you do from zone 2. So people say, well, why don't I just do this? Now, part of it comes down to the frequency of the dose. You may have seen one of the videos I said, we've got 3 levers: frequency, intensity, and duration. Now, frequency for a lot of you is the lever that is probably most effective in developing an aerobic base and becoming a better runner. Frequency, I'm not just talking about 1 week, I'm talking chronically over months. Because if we're able to consistently, how would I draw this? So if we have a continuous dose of zone 2 running, and this is, say this is weeks, and we have 5 times per week, we are getting an aerobic zone 2 stimulus. So all of these weeks have 5 times aerobic stimulus. One thing I can guarantee is that you can recover from that stimulus. Both mechanically, the stimulus is relatively low, and then biomechanically, or I guess biochemically, the stimulus is also relatively low in which you can recover from. When we introduce high intensity interval training, both the biochemical and biomechanical stimulus increase. So we kind of just keep this. So this we'll call green is going to be HIIT training. So it is a very intensive dose. And not only does it really intensively do all those stimulating factors that I had mentioned before in zone 2, whereas we have, I'll just call this like moderate dose, where I guess stimulus and adaptation are in balance. Stimulus and adaptation are out of balance with high intensity interval training, which means recovery, so if we have a down arrow for recovery, needs to be in line with the stimulus. Now, most of you are so addicted to frequency in terms of wanting to run 5, 6, whatever amount of times per week. As soon as we introduce an increased stimulus, we are often pretty bad at reducing the subsequent stimulus in order to get adaptation. So whether that's the next day's 30 minutes rather than 60 minutes, or we have a complete day off, or we have to have one of these weeks down to 4 times a week. Whereas when we have zone 2 running, there's not much need for these recovery periods because we're pretty much in a balance of our stimulus and adaptation. Although there will need to be a change in stimulus if we're running, say, 5 times a week across 7 weeks. We either need to increase the dose, the stimulus, or decrease the stimulus to allow for an adaptation. Depends on how that equation is working. But it is a lot more predictable, and why a base phase is so important in building a runner up to the point where they can train hard and get the most out of themselves, because when you're able to do this, you set the foundation. So whether you're doing polarized or pyramidal, whatever it is, it all requires a huge aerobic base. So when we are looking at zone 2 training, and we're looking at purely that metabolic process that I drew up before, where we have AMPK and we have reactive oxygen species, and we have PGC1 alpha stimulating the mitochondrial biogenesis so we can get more mitochondria, it occurs based off of frequency of the dose and being able to recover. It is not so, I guess, it is not needed as much to have the intensity of the dose, at least initially, because frequency will outweigh the impact or concentration of the dose. Like we can get a far more condensed dose of stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis through high intensity interval training, but we may not be able to get the chronic over time period where we can then build a chronic adaptation to become a more fit, aerobically fit individual. And so really what it comes down to is, over time, if you do 7 weeks of 5 times per week of aerobic base, zone 2 runs without drifting into zone 3, you get 35 sessions where you're able to stimulate the increase, everything that goes along with becoming a more aerobically fit individual. And that does not matter whether you're at the bottom or the top, because it's the consistent dose of the stimulus that is the most important part. Because if you drift towards the top, we start to increase the mechanical stimulus, we increase the chemical stimulus, we increase the catecholaminergic, so that's the neuroepinephrine, epinephrine, adrenaline, all of those that stimulate an increase in carbohydrate metabolism, and then a potential sparing of carbohydrate in the blood, so maintain blood sugar so that our brain doesn't starve, especially if we're not, yes, you could drift into the argument that we can use ketones, and so that's a whole different topic of carbohydrate manipulation. But it doesn't matter. You are at more risk of reducing your overall aerobic building capacity over time if you run to the top of zone 2 than if you run at the bottom, because we are only considering or concerned about building an aerobic base to become a better aerobic runner. If we wanted to push to the top of something, we should be pushing our harder sessions so that when we do try to build, where am I going to draw this graph? I guess I'll get rid of this. Because when we draw out that energy intensity graph and we have that lactate threshold curve, now if we actually put numbers on the intensity, so let's just call it, for the sake of this, 3-hour marathon pace, and then we're going to call it like 38-minute 10K pace, just so I'm not having to do minutes per K or minutes per mile. So what we want to be able to do is increase our capacity to make that 37-minute 10K and a 2:55 pace. That's what we want at these points, right? So our lactate threshold, we've gone faster. Our aerobic threshold, we've gotten faster. Now, will this happen purely off of doing that aerobic training? To some point it will, because you remember when we have our crossover point and the other carbohydrates were red, what we can do is we can shift our actual total energy expenditure at these points in time. So what can happen there is what was previously our crossover point, or if we called it, I'll use green for zone 2, I did blue for zone 2 before. Zone 2, that 3 hour starts to shift backwards, where 3-hour pace is now relatively a lower percentage of our overall threshold, as is the 38-minute 10K. But we do need to be able to train in this domain and all these domains over here to increase our anaerobic work capacity. So when we have that cell and we have the mitochondria in here, and then we want to increase the number of those mitochondria, the best way to do it is to elicit large continuous stimulus of zone 2, because we just can't, and especially, I'm not going to tell a 50-year-old man to run sprints 5 times a week. You'd fall apart. 20-year-old, sure. Professional runner, maybe. And I know a lot of cyclists have done this because, there's a reduced mechanical loading of cycling compared to running because the bike's holding you up. Same with swimming. So if you've ever done triathlon, you can swim hard most sessions, whereas the impact loading, the eccentric contractions they require to stop us falling into the ground are so demanding that if we can situate ourselves in large frequencies of zone 2 run and we go towards the bottom, we still get all the benefits of zone 2 running without the risk. And risk mitigation is a big point when we're looking at your standard weekend runner, because as soon, remember, I had all of those weeks adding up with 5 times per week, as soon as we have to eliminate those, we reduce all of this stimulus, the AMPK, the PGC1 alpha, all that just kind of disappears. All that stimulus disappears. And you've heard the term use it or lose it. There's no point having excess energetic cost in our body if we're not using it. So we'll just eventually get rid of it just through standard protein turnover within the body, and we will get less fit. It takes, a while, but we're trying to be as maximally fit as possible. That's not a natural state for the human body to exist in. So by operating at the lower end of zone 2, we can reduce the risk while still being able to not necessarily maximize our potential for adaptation, but at least we're going to maintain a relatively non-equivocal or non-differential state of adaptation. So what I mean is that if you were going to do all of these weeks, we'll do blue for zone 2, right? And we're going to go top zone 2 versus, I'll just put B for bottom zone 2. I really struggle to think that you would notice a difference if you ran at 75% of your lactate threshold versus 88% of your lactate threshold via heart rate, say, or just whatever. Actually, it doesn't really matter in this instance. So when we're doing that, I really don't think you'd notice a difference. Where fitness will come and specificity to your race performance, like a 38 dropping down to a 37-minute 10K, is when you elicit the stimulus, both biomechanically and biochemically, that is going to be related to that demand. So then when we're looking at maximizing like our actual ability to become a better runner in the chosen event that we're looking to compete at, 10K marathon, whatever, there are ways that you can then begin to integrate hard training to increase all those the stimuli for the appropriate processes that I talked about. So like high intensity interval training, I do like putting some of that in the base period because of all those positive increased demand stimulating things that I talked about. But we have to remember the recovery component that comes along with these kind of workouts. And that's why formulating a training plan that is well-rounded and built off the back of science and is balanced in terms of its stimulus and recovery is going to be super valuable. But for the most part, what a lot of people need to be able to do is just get some consistent, frequent stimulus in zone 2, and that'll maximally benefit them over a chronic period of time. We're not looking 1 week, we're not looking 2 weeks, we're looking 2 months, 3 months. 2 months at least. I know Arthur Lydiard used to say 12 weeks, 3 months, 100-mile weeks, aerobically. You can do the odd, hard out and back or like a 20-minute time trial, 5K time trial, but otherwise just do that before anything. Then you'll be ready to become a better runner. Now, none of us, maybe one of you out there watching this is in the position where you can run 100-mile weeks, 160 kilometers a week aerobically, but you probably would be highly more likely to do it if you did run at the bottom of zone 2. But that's overall, I probably have rambled a little bit in terms of made this slightly more confusing than it needs to be. But I want to kind of get into the science behind why there's not a massive difference between the top and the bottom. There's just a lower risk at the bottom. So yes, you can go to the top. And yes, it's okay to drift out of zone 2 on occasions. You're not going to completely outdo or undo a zone 2 run because you drifted into zone 3. It's not what you do some of the times that matters, what you do all of the time that matters. And it's the chronic consistent stimulus for aerobic or mitochondrial biogenesis that's going to increase our ability to utilize oxygen and fat within our running so that we can become faster aerobically. And then beyond that, we can build our capacity for anaerobic metabolism, our cadence, stride rate, stride length, that's going to make us faster. And then just the buffering capacity of lactate by itself, exporting, importing glucose and other fuel sources, well, not other fuel sources, but the rate at which we can do that will all make us a better runner. But it all starts with the aerobic base, because we have a poor base and we have a really bad crossover point. So our crossover point, say it happens that's it. Like at the bottom of zone 2, because we just haven't really trained very much and we haven't really trained very long. When we go to do a marathon, we may look at percentages and, I'm like, I started 88% of your lactate threshold heart rate, allow it to drift to 90% over the first 30 minutes, then 90 to 92%. Well, for someone who hasn't trained large distances or for very long chronically, then their low crossover point means they are metabolizing a lot more carbohydrate than is sustainable over a long duration, and they'll inevitably hit the wall no matter how much they supplement with carbohydrate, just because of the sheer nature of the total energetic output over a chronic period of time. So I'm not sure if that's made you more confused or less confused, but it at least was something that I want to get off my mind. So I hope it helps. And if you have any questions, post them up, and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.